Hi folks, it's Keith Beardsley with the Beardsley Real Estate Team and Century 21. Now this will be part two of what's an offer. Part one is already posted and online. This is a follow-up to that one. Now in the first part, we took the first few pages of an offer and showed you what the different parts were and some of the requirements and what's required to fulfill them, that type of thing, and how important some of those particular clauses can be. So today we're going to look again, go back to the offer again, but we're going to be looking at what is called Schedule A. Schedule A is where all the clauses go, all the conditions go. And what I'll do is for Schedule A, I'll introduce it to you on the screen so you know what it looks like. And then I'm going to go into essentially one of the Word programs and just show you how some of these offers are written. So how do we word some of these clauses? Because some of it can be quite important. Now, not every agent will use the same wording. Agents like to have their own clauses written the way they like them. So it may vary, but the bulk of the material is going to be similar. All right, so here we go. Let's go back and take a look at the offer form, and then we'll take a look at what we call Schedule A. Now, as you will recall, this is what the offer agreement looks like. It's Form 100. So I'm not going to waste too much time on this. We spent quite a bit of time on it before. I want to go all the way down because these are all pages that are attached. And go all the way down to Schedule A. Here we are here. This is an extremely important part of any offer. So it's all part of that same offer from before. So obviously there's the buyers, there's the sellers, all right, same as before. And it's again for the purchase and sale of, that's going to be your address. This will be the date that you're putting the offer in. So the address of the property, the date that you're submitting it. And that's extremely important to get right. So the first one you're going to see, it says buyer agrees to pay the balance as follows. And there's a fairly standard clause that goes in there which talks about the large balance transfer and so on. This is where you're telling the seller that you're going to pay up and pay the full balance. So if you've got a $5,000 deposit, then you're paying whatever the price of that house is minus the $5,000. So this just assures the seller that that's exactly what you're going to do. And if we go down to the bottom of the offer, so bottom of Schedule A, there again, there's the initials for the buyer and the seller once they get it. So let's go back up now, and now we're going to switch over to what do some of the clauses actually look like. Now this is just a sample. Like I say, different agents like different ones. All right, so what we have here now, this is like I say, it's a Word program, so the exact wording here can be changed based on whatever that particular house might be or property might be. And these are predominantly country clauses. They're some of the ones that I use. Other agents will use pretty much the same standard wording. Some agents like to have entirely their own wording. It doesn't matter as long as the basic information is there. So this is some of what you would probably see in an offer if you were buying a house out in the country, or if you were selling a house and someone was bringing you an offer. These are some of the clauses you're going to see. So the first one, these are conditions. So in other words, if these are not fulfilled and these were not successful, the odds are that sale is going to fall through unless some type of negotiation could be made. So the most obvious one right now, it's probably going to be in virtually every single offer, it'd be very unusual if it isn't, is a finance clause. All right, so the banks right now are being very, very fussy, very picky about things. They're asking for appraisals and so on. So even if you're pre-approved, even if the bank says, yeah, you're good to go, they're much safer to put this particular clause in and make sure that the bank will actually agree to the sale of that house. There are some properties they won't want to cover. So it just reads, this offer is conditional upon the buyer arranging the buyer's own expense. Now, keeping in mind, most of these clauses, the buyer is paying for. So the bank may insist, that if for an appraisal, you owe them $500 or $750, whatever it happens to be. So it just says that at the buyer's expense, obtaining a firm commitment on a new first mortgage. So in other words, the bank has to give you in writing something that says, yes, here's what your mortgage is going to be, here's the interest rate on it. And of course, you have to agree to it. If the bank says no, then that deal is dead. And it's also an inspection of the property by an inspector of the buyer's choice, and finding the report satisfactory to the buyer's sole and absolute discretion. All this means is you're entitled to a home inspector to go and look at that house and give you a written report if that's what you want, and ask them, here's what's wrong. This doesn't work. This doesn't wrong. The roof has got problems. All sorts of different things that a home inspector is going to find. And remember, if you're a first-time buyer, the home inspector will always find something wrong with a resale home. No home is perfect, so you have to look at what is wrong with that house and how important is it. A lot of it's going to be very, very minor stuff. So again, this is something that it's done at the buyer's expense. So what's a home inspection now? Will depend on who you use, but you're looking probably somewhere $700 to $750, somewhere in that range. Offer is conditional upon the buyer determining at the buyer's own expense that adequate water supply to meet the buyer's needs. Pump and all related equipment serving the property is in working order, and that they can get your potable water. So what does that mean? Well, it's conditional on the buyer, again, paying, and checking that, because we're almost all of us out here, unless you're in one of the municipalities, we're on the wells. So you need to have someone check, make sure the pump is working, make sure that there's enough water, that the well isn't going to run dry if two or three people take a shower, that type of thing. So there's a number of ways of doing it. A lot of the time it's your home inspector who will check some of this stuff out. And there's also professional water inspectors, and they usually run probably, again, around 700. I mean, it's, give or take a bit, depends on who you use. But there are people there who will do all those particular checks. The bacteriological analysis of the drinking water is very important. Some banks will not approve a mortgage unless you can provide that paper. So what are we looking at? We're looking at essentially a water test, different ways of doing it. One of these water experts will actually take samples and so on, tell you if it's hard water, whatever the water is like, and they will normally have a private lab that they will take the analysis to. It can also be done by the agent for the buyer, who will make an appointment, come to the house, and do take a water sample to the provincial lab, and that usually takes a few days. So those are the types of things that are going to be required. Now, if you notice, it says all of which are to be satisfactory to the buyer and the buyer's sole and absolute direction. So if you really don't like something that comes up in that home inspection report or anything else, you can say, no, we're not going to go through with the sale. Most of the time, I'm going to say 90% plus of the time, though, that can be negotiated. So it could be that they determine, the home inspector determines that the furnace is just about dead. Well, cost of a new furnace, negotiate that. If you really want that house, maybe you can split the difference. Maybe you can come to some arrangement with the, with the buyer or with the seller, depending on which end you're on, and come to a deal as to how that cost is going to be done. If you're on the seller's end, sometimes you just take a little bit off the selling price. There's all sorts of different ways of doing that. And in this case, like I say, the buyer can say, no, we're not going to complete, and go look for another house. Generally speaking, though, if they really want that house, something could be worked out. And notice the deadline here, because this is extremely important. 8 p.m. on such and such a date. That's where we would put the date. Now, I use 8 p.m. Some agents like 9, some like 10. It's up to us. I like 8, because if there is an issue, we can still have time that night to try and solve it. So if you say, I've got a 10-day condition on financing, that's where that goes. If you don't complete that condition, in other words, the bank hasn't gotten back to you, and say you've asked for 10 days and the bank hasn't gotten back to you, well, you better find out why, and you better get an extension If if it's the bank is just saying, well, we're slow, we're waiting for an appraiser or something like that. So the conditions can be extended, but that's on a separate form. So the deadlines here are very important. You can't sit back and wait to the last minute and then say, okay, yeah, no, I'm on the ninth day. I still got a day to get all this done. Doesn't work that way. Once those conditions are in and the offer is accepted, you have to get moving very, very quickly and get those conditions done. And in some cases, um, when it's marked as a conditional sale, the seller is still allowing showings. So other people can still look at the house whilst you're doing your conditions. And here's another one. And this is a big one, number 4. And again, same things apply. There's going to be a deadline, a time, and a date. And a country property, this offer is conditional upon the buyer determining at the buyer's expense again, right? All sewage systems serving the property are wholly within the setback requirements of the property and received all required certificates. All this means is they're talking about the septic system. So it has to be a legal septic system. The bed for that septic system has to be entirely within your property. And I'll tell you, in some of the older homes, like the real old ones from the 1890s up to maybe, let's say the 1930s, we've had several where the actual septic system doesn't empty into that property; it empties into a neighbor's property. So those are things that are illegal now. Would have been fine years ago, but not anymore. And again, that's another inspection. It's probably going to cost you somewhere between 700 and again, who you use is up to you. Most of the agents in the country have septic inspectors that they know, that they trust, and so on. And again, see, there's the deadline by 8 p.m. on such a day. What a lot of us like to do is put everything for the same day. So the finance, the septic, water, whatever, all of those conditions would all come due at 8 p.m. on the same day. And this sort of focuses everybody on that date, and you tend not to miss one, because if you're busy, we're busy. You don't want to miss a condition and have the thing fall through. So it's just an easy way for us to do it. The other one down here, this is sort of just a general one. Seller agrees to cooperate. So in other words, if you have conditions, seller has to allow you to exercise those conditions. So your agent will schedule a home inspection, the time and a date, just like you do for a showing. They'll also do a septic inspection. Sometimes both on the same day, if they can coordinate that. It just saves everybody a lot of effort. For those, they usually want the buyer with them. So if it's a home inspector and you're deciding, yeah, sure, we'll use this home inspector, make sure that if it's a husband and wife, that at least one of you is there with the inspector, because they will point things out to you. They will also generally tell you what's urgent and what isn't, what you do down the road whenever you want to, type of thing. Now, in the country, a lot of us like to have that septic tank pumped, and that becomes a clause in there. Now, if you're seller, don't have it pumped until after the septic inspection, because it's much easier for them, a much more accurate inspection if it hasn't yet been pumped. And usually just prior to the completion date, you call in the pumper, they pump it out, they give you a receipt, and that receipt goes to the lawyers and everybody knows it's being done. And again, for the purpose of mortgage appraisal, here it says the seller shall allow the buyer and his representatives reasonable access. So there may be a requirement by the bank for a mortgage appraisal, maybe an insurance appraisal, just depends. The seller will generally always agree to that type of thing, because that's the only way the house is going to get sold. But again, it has to be reasonable. Don't plan on doing something at 10 o'clock at night. Most of this is done during the morning or afternoon. And here's another one. Seller basically represents and warrants. So the seller is saying that anything included, in other words, the furnace is working, the heating's working, the central air is working, stoves are working, that type of thing. So that's where that clause will come in there. There's no timeline on that. It's assumed that on closing day, everything is working. All right, and that's extremely important. Now, this is a clause that I like to put in. Seller will remove all personal property, save and except for those articles identified as chattel. So other than say they're selling the stove and the fridge and things like that, they have to remove everything else. So if they've got a yard full of who knows what, garbage or sometimes old vehicles, or whatever the case might be. They have to leave the house basically tidy, and they remove all of this stuff. It's not up to you, the buyer, to remove stuff. It's up to the seller to leave the property in a clean and tidy state. Now, if you don't put that in, well, then I guess it becomes how nice the seller is. But I always like to put it in because that way the buyer who's buying the property is not going to be saddled with removing stuff and removing it. That costs money too. Now, the seller agrees to leave inside the home on closing building plans, mechanical drawings, and so on. So if you have these type of items, and big thing here is essentially in their possession. Um, let's say things like well, the keys to the mailbox. You have a furnace, and you've got the plans that came with the furnace. How to operate it, that type of thing. That's where you tend to leave all of that stuff. And see, the buyers have the right to visit the property one further time. I like one because you're there for all the inspections. If you need to do window measurements or things like that, do it when you're doing the inspections. Don't come in at the last minute and say to the seller, "Oh yeah, I want 2 or 3 inspections because I haven't done any of this." You've already been there for a number of hours. A home inspection can take generally about 4 hours. Septic inspection can take almost as long. So you're there for a while. Anything that you think you need to do, anything you need to measure, whether you need to measure a room to make sure a certain piece of furniture fits, do all of that then. And over here, parties consent to and agree electronic signatures. This is something new that's come in the last few years. A lot of it, as I said, a lot of this is done now electronically by various signature programs, and every agent has access to one of the programs. There's different types, but it just says that you all agree that people can do it by electronic signature. I always like to, when an offer is being written up, and before it's sent in, sit down with the buyer and say, here's all the clauses, here's why they're here, and so on. Um, Once it comes back, the seller counters, well, then depending on who your buyers are and how experienced they are, some of this can be done electronically, and it can go very quickly that way. You can actually do this on your smartphone, on your computer. There's all sorts of different ways. The next clause is one that has come in the last few years, and this is by electronic funds transfer. So it used to be with your deposit, you wrote a check, and some would insist on a certified check and so on. You wrote a check, and that check was handed over to the other office. A lot of the companies out there now allow for electronic funds transfer, so you can do that through your bank. And depending on the amount of the transfer, sometimes you might have to do two. But essentially, you can do this with most of the companies. I think right now, I know mine. You can. Easiest thing to do is when you're ready to do the deposit. Ask your agent. Do you know how the other company is going to want it? Some companies may still insist on the check. It just depends. All right, so you do whatever's required. And then this I always put in now because property assessments were frozen in 2016 by the government. So not 2016, 2020 were frozen in 2020. So the last property assessment is based on January of 2016. So there's been no updates to the assessments through MPAC and that since 2020. So sooner or later there will be a change, and the government will open it up again and say, let's start updating the assessed value of the house. So there you go. That's sort of a very general overview as to the different parts of an offer. In this case, this particular video is Schedule A. Whether you're buying or you're on the selling side receiving an offer, I mean, your agent can probably answer most of your questions, but remember that as a buyer or a seller, you always reserve that right to ask your lawyer to interpret something or for advice as well. That can never be taken away from you. And as I said, a lot of offers, you will actually see that written into an offer. So it just depends on circumstances and what it is that you, the buyer or seller, want to do. So there you go, Keith Beardsley of the Beardsley team in Century 21. Wishing you a great day. We hope this was helpful. Have a good day.